Rich Berliner from the Connected Virtual Tech event today. And I want to welcome all of you to this groundbreaking event of our first virtual trade show. And so I want to welcome our panelists today. I want to encourage everybody first and foremost to go into the event and visit the exhibitors, the chat rooms, and all the other things that are going on with this event. Please understand you don't need to be involved for 2 straight days. There's been some comments and people have asked the question, do I need to be involved for 2 straight days? The answer is you may come and go as you like, and this will be available for 30 days from now for your viewing pleasure. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panel. We have Dicscipio from Tavistock, Eric Abbott, who is an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, Rahul Bammi from View, and Emmanuel Daniel from Microsoft. So let's get started. Ken, this panel was really came out of discussions that you and I have had about what's going to happen in buildings when we want to get back into the swing and helping landlords understand what their opportunities are. And you and I have discussed things that you're doing in your development, Lake Nona, that is Tavistock development. And you've been sort of my guy, Johnny on the spot in terms of talking about smart buildings. So can you help us to understand what's going on in the smart building world from your standpoint and what it takes to get back in terms of cleaning buildings, in terms of new technologies, in terms of what we're going to have to do and sort of the view from where you sit?
Sure. And thanks for having me, Rich. You know, I think that the original conversation we had was about, you know, we're going into this period that's an unknown. And I think part of the original conversation was if this had happened 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't be as prepared, right? So over the last 10, 15 years, companies like Gensler and CBRE and other service providers and in-house real estate departments have really had a slow migration or transition to allowing people to work from home and setting them up with better tools. We have more people have laptops today than they had 10, 15 years ago. People have more tools like, you know, what we're on today in terms of Zoom. And I think with the iPhone and the original conversation we had was, you know, I think 45 days ago, I think the number was around 5.2% of people work from home. Today and going forward, they're saying that could stable out at over 30% of people working from home. So what we're seeing in March in terms of people setting up home offices and online orders for office equipment is just booming. So I think that's going to be, it's going to be more accepted. It's going to be a trend that's not going to go away. You know, what we're hearing is that when we go back to the office space, you're going to see things, for example, infrared monitoring when you enter a building is going to be taking temperatures of employees. You're going to see data analytics being gathered around people, how long they're washing their hands. You're going to see more voice recognition tools in elevators and opening doorways up. And so you're going to see it start to snowball in terms of these other tools that start to spread us out, right? We'll be sitting in, you know, Cushman Wakefield is rolling out a program that they're trying and talking about, you know, spreading cubicles out and spreading people out 6 feet apart. You're going to see more of designated lanes within the office where traffic lanes, where people in an open environment are going to, you know, directional. They're going to be arrows on the floor and they're going to be pointed directional. You're going to see more antibacterial coatings being applied. And so, you know, it goes on and on. In terms of what we may see, and the trend I'm seeing over and over as I speak to the service providers and the architects, what happened is we may see a decrease in the population that's occupying the office space, but we may see an increase in the amount of space that they're occupying. So I'll stop there and take a breath. And
well, yeah, but one of the things that you and I have talked about, and unfortunately, we couldn't find anybody who was not too busy to come on and be with us today, was this UV disinfecting of offices. And that's really this conversation started. It was like, you know, it's what piqued my interest in talking about not only that topic, but lots and lots of others. But I mean, that is a fantastic way rather than wiping down desks and doing, what I'm doing. I'm walking around with my with my disinfecting cloth and my bottle of alcohol here. So how does that affect it? And are you using those techniques and those technologies right now to clean your buildings and to, sort of work towards this return to work?
Yeah. So Lake Nona is an interesting place. Lake Nona is a place where you go back 15 years ago, and the mission was, how do you create the best version of yourself, right? We had very innovative thinkers who were saying, how do we build a community around occupiers of commercial space? That could be office, could be retail, could be industrial. And then we have a fairly robust residential community we've built. And we became this place to innovate and try products out, right? And I've said this 100 times to you, and we talk about it often. It all hinged on the concept of efficiencies, productivity, recruiting, and retention, right? Everything had to sort of contribute to those four things. And so we started incubating products, and originally we had we're working with two companies. And originally what would happen was we started looking at products that would contribute to efficiencies, right? And so the UV lighting, where there was a company, Violet Defense, which was making a ceiling tile that met the standards of well building standards, right? As part of well building standards, you could check that box by sterilizing your office every 2 weeks. And so Violet Defense was making a ceiling tile that could, 15 minutes could have a sterilization rate. And it's the same technology that's been around since 1918 in the hospitals. And I know that Eric's going to touch on this a little later as well. But you start looking at these technologies and how do you reduce sick days, right, in the workplace? And then we started working with several companies, and how do we incorporate that into the home? And you can put it into your bathroom. You can sterilize your bathroom. You can sterilize, kitchen countertops. And so this is something we've had and we've been talking about for several years. And it was always a topic that I love to talk about, but most people glazed over it. Now it's at the front and center. Right now, everyone's talking about using these technologies. I'll mention one of the other areas that we've, this call is a prime example. When we got on the call originally, we were worried about our bandwidth in terms of, is everyone going to have the right equipment? And I'm sitting up in Lake Tahoe, and unfortunately, I don't have the robust bandwidth that I have in Lake Nona. But back in 2007, our CEO at the time made a decision with our founder to put in a robust fiber and give everyone a gig. And that's now being boosted to 2 gigs. But what it's enabled is people are working from home. We already had 29% of the residents in Lake Nona work from home. So now you're looking at these tools that are really coming and becoming more important in terms of how we work from home and how we do these conference calls.
Gotcha. So can your discussions and the thought process has led me to, obviously, one of the most important issues of our time is what's going on in hospitals and healthcare situations. And so we have a fellow named Eric Abbott on this call. Eric is an adjunct professor at Northwestern, but Eric has been writing some material for us in our weekly newsletter, which I hope all of you get and read. Eric, let's talk about this in terms of what's going on in your world and in hospitals and healthcare. You are an experienced wireless guy too. So what's happening in terms of what we're doing in hospitals vis-a-vis what Ken is talking about with new technologies and disinfecting and communications? Give us the view from where you sit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's Ken's touched on a multitude of different things, and I'll first start with disinfection management. So when we look at things like hand hygiene compliance, for instance, there's a lot of existing technologies that are now being deployed across hospital facilities that automate that process. Why is that important? For obvious reasons. We want to stop people from being disease vectors. Where mobility comes into a huge play with that is that we overlay an infrastructure that looks at associating objects and people with specific activities. So what we'll do is hand hygiene on entry into a patient room and then upon exit. And we'll use timers and so forth to see, did they spend enough time at that hand hygiene station, if you will, whether it's gel or a sink, washing in and so forth. And then we can look at, if we do have an incident, how does that then map? Other technologies we're using, the thermal scanners were mentioned. There's actually a lot of vendors that have brought products online where you can, it's just almost like the airport metal scanners. You walk through it, we can set alerts, notifications, and so forth, see if someone has a high thermal reading. So FLIR systems makes cameras, for instance, that are able to do this rapidly. And then we can have notifications and alerts that act on that information. We can also optionally do biofacial recognition technology with that. So one of the adjunct benefits of this is in some ways we can eliminate the use of security badges and so forth by using biofacial recognition technology in combination with the thermal. Now there are biometric legislations that we need to be cognizant of. The state of Illinois is a good example of that. So it's not something that's ubiquitous. Other technologies that can touched upon include the room sterilization. And this is particularly intriguing. And there's a whole host of different capabilities depending on what it is we're trying to get accomplished. So for instance, we can use robots to disinfect patient rooms or certain areas after the occupants have left using intense UVC. We can have small boxes. We call them UVC ovens where you can put in tablets, smartphones, and so forth. So many healthcare systems are doing that now for patient-issued tablets as a way to sanitize and disinfect them in combination with wiping. For operating rooms and so forth, interesting technologies here. In addition to using UVC, we can actually use what's called blue light technology. So we know that there's certain bacteria that are sensitive to specific wavelengths of blue light. So as opposed to the UVC technology, which can be damaging to some materials, we can use that technology to reduce those types of pathogens. Electrostatic precipitators, also known as electronic air cleaners, is technology that's been around for many, many years now. Some of us may even have them, those in our homes, and that works in a central application. So think of the central air handler and so forth. And then dry hydrogen peroxide is another example.
In other words, you're going to, if the virus is in the air, you're going to be able to kill the virus with an electrostatic device in the air handler.
Exactly. So we can get it in the airstream. We can get it localized, so in situ. So an example there, I was just talking about the dry hydrogen rain. So we can have devices in the room that basically propagate what's called dry hydrogen peroxide. And what that does is it's just hydroxyl radicals. They neutralize any sort of pathogens. What's very important to keep in mind with all these technologies, and it's not just for hospitals, it could be used in enterprise locations and so forth, is there's advantages and disadvantages with each depending on the particular environment. So for instance, what we'll see is different uses of them. So it's not a one size fits all depending on what we're trying to do. So in areas where there's a lot of like entrances and exits and so forth, there we want to use one set of technology, or whereas if we're in a controlled space, we'll use a different type of technology.
So Eric, one of the things I let Ken off the hook, but we're going to get to him when we go back around in terms of this is really a connectivity and communications forum with a big dollop of tech on top of it. But so one of the things you and I were talking about is you have coronavirus patients that are basically walled off from the rest of the hospital, and you are giving them devices, you're using connectivity to monitor. So can we talk through the connectivity piece of this before,
Absolutely.
we just talk about the devices and all the technology, which is great stuff, and we all need to know about that. But talk to me about the connectivity piece of it, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's where we've been able to really, it's sort of the silent hero in all this today is the connectivity piece. The reason for that is we've been able to improve clinical effectiveness, operational efficiencies, and patient satisfaction and experiences using connectivity to keep caregivers and patients connected while physically separate. So when we look at things such as PPE shortages, when we look at the virulence of this pathogen and so forth, ensuring that we have that sort of separation becomes paramount, while at the same time, we still have to address the issue of providing patient care. And that patient care consists of vitals monitoring, as well as what's called virtual rounding. Now, what connectivity provides here is a way for us to have we'll call it telemedicine sessions in situ. So actually inside the healthcare facility where we do the video and the voice chat, we do simultaneously data streaming from, sometimes they call it tele-ICU, from vitals. So that would be pulse ox, that could be your heart rate, it could be one or more EKG leads, it could also be your blood pressure and so forth. So all this information is streamed through a wireless network, in addition to having the ability for the patient or the nurse or the physician to be able to initiate a session with that patient. And what this is, what we've seen is this has been extremely effective. Now, where this is really being demonstrated is what's called surge applications. Surge applications being where we don't have enough or sufficient hospital beds for sick patients, COVID or non-COVID. And what we're able to do with connectivity now is we're able to rapidly convert large facilities. So stadiums, a great example would be McCormick Place, the big convention center in Chicago, or physician office buildings and so forth, use wireless technologies, whether it be Wi-Fi or cellular, to be able to stand up very quickly these telemedicine capabilities that incorporate, as I mentioned, the voice, video, as well as the data.
Right. So, Eric, I'm going to come back around to you because I want to talk about more of those devices and the connectivity piece. But I'd like to go to Emmanuel now. Emmanuel, you are with the this little company that probably not many people have heard of, the most valuable company in the world, Microsoft. And so I wanted to talk with you today about sort of from where you sit, and you're more of a guy working on campus-wide networks and, you know, the communications inside the buildings. So what are the challenges from your world in terms of getting people back in the buildings? I assume your folks are working off-site too, but talk us through what's going on in your world, because again, you are, you know, the thought leader in many ways, Microsoft being the thought leader in many ways on this. So talk us through what you are thinking.
The biggest challenge, Rich, is when we're talking about campus-wide experiences is how do we motivate people to come back to work? How do we get them into a setting where they are more comfortable, more relaxed, more open to engage and collaborate as we're shifting times and tides now? How do we do that is we start focusing about what are the experiences that we can provide on a campus that they can't get anywhere else? How do we drive engagement between people in terms of interactions that they can't get anywhere else? And how do we do that in an ethical manner while also focusing on privacy? A lot of the stuff that we talk about today, especially within buildings, when we start collecting personal data, whatever type of data that may be, people will react negatively. How do we give them that guarantee that right from the moment they wake up and they decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to get to work today. What are my choices? How do I get to work safely? Once I come to the work, what choices do I have to get to my place of work? How do I meet people that I want to? How do I collaborate with them? How do I share data with them? We always talk about working remotely, but at the same time, a lot of it happens through ad hoc collaboration, ad hoc group discussions. How do I create an environment that would allow people to come together, organize the space dynamically in a situation that meets their needs? So working through all these aspects while focusing on how impactful the productivity can be, while also catering to their physical and emotional wellness in a space where they're going to spend a majority of their time in, is what we try to do. tied to that, identifying the detailed types of data that we'll capture, how that data will be used, and why people would be willing to give up that information to drive productivity in the way they have their interactions across campus.
Yep. So I assume that there's, at this point, that there's a big emphasis on Microsoft Teams. And I assume that there's a big emphasis on making sure that everyone from home, whatever, as we were talking about in our first panel of the day, has great connectivity, has total security, and all of those things. But there must be an enormous amount of data that's generated in this. And can you give us some sense of, what connectivity pieces are you using to share all that data and to get the message from person to person across in the company, but also to make sure you're overseeing what's happening amongst your people?
So it varies based on the experience and the scenario that we are in. If I'm in an open space, choices of either going with a Wi-Fi mesh versus a Bluetooth mesh versus a LoRaWAN network in terms of the types and volumes of data. If I start with the building as a whole, right, the building, to drive efficiency within that building, tracking the performance of every asset in that building, holistically, we're talking about 500 million messages that come through. The volume of the messages, the size of the message.
500 million messages a day?
Yes, a period that come through. If you're looking at a campus as large as ours. Now, within that, processing that volume of messages to ensure that you're driving efficiency of the assets in terms of how they're performing, how they're responding to both internal factors and external factors. Now, this is the efficiency of the assets where the core facilities teams deals with. Now, if I move beyond that and I start looking at something like, let's take wayfinding, real-time blue dot turn-by-turn navigation, where I'm guiding people within my buildings across the campus to move around. Okay, the latency associated with that really cannot be more than a few milliseconds. People won't use it. Now, if I move from there and I start talking about asset tracking, how do I track assets where people start moving things around? People start moving around. In addition to that, our campus also has a huge network of transportation with our shuttles, our connectors. You probably have seen them. I mean, if you're down in Seattle, going around, tracking all of this data and communicating it to people through the right channels in a way that they can digest. Right? Today we're talking about what is 5G going to look like for our campus? What are the considerations we have to do? What is our last mile connection strategy? How do we extract, transmit, store, and maintain that data is a big part of our day-to-day discussions.
Gotcha. So one of the things that's going on as part of this event is we have exhibitors, and I have to thank all the sponsors and exhibitors that are part of this event, and they gave everyone the ability to join us for free, all the attendees to join us for free. So I have a great debt of gratitude for all of those companies that are exhibiting and sponsoring here. But one of the things that they're here on our virtual floor talking about is the connectivity. In other words, there are many of the companies that have done hospitals and healthcare facilities, and many of the companies have done installations of 5G and things like that at Lake Nona and in CBRS installations that they're working on. So I hope that everybody who's watching us today will visit the exhibit booths and talk to the companies, speak back and forth virtually with the companies that are here, because it's so important that if there's anyone out there that's watching, looking for help and information, that they talk to the exhibitors. But from that standpoint, Emmanuel, are you continuously looking at the new technologies that are coming and evaluating those things, Wi-Fi 6 and CBRS, which you and I discussed the other day a little bit? Is there a constant drumbeat to what's new, what's next, what's going on, what are we going to use this, how are we going to control all of this data?
There definitely is. And one of the key reasons to do that is when you take a campus, within a campus, you have different types of people. Within different types of people, you have different age groups as well. And I have to cater for everybody and anybody who comes onto the campus. And the younger generation coupled with the baby boomers, how do I engage those people? And that's where the focus and quest to talk about innovative technology starts to come in. With innovative technologies, we're always trying to look out for what is the next most important thing that people would want? And we try to steer away from technology for technology's sake. That's not the intention. What drives the engagement between people? What drives the efficiency and performance of those buildings? For example, if I'm talking about a garage, and we all go into a garage, we try, and the car gets lost. How do I drive engagement of user services? So when a person drives through a garage, and a garage as large, let's say as large as 6,000 cars, they don't lose sight of where they park. They're able to navigate back to the exact location. How do I ensure safety? So when a person enters a garage, I don't have to have an app that calls out on the phone to say turn left and turn right, but the signage across the garage is integrated to the navigation path of your vehicle. So stuff like that, in terms we're trying to make personalization of the services that we provide, so the individual feels that these services are catered to him. Okay, and what technology would drive that is things that we're after. We spoke about 5G. The whole thing with 5G is, if I have to do 5G, I'm going to have infrastructure cost tied to it. Implementing that infrastructure cost across a campus in terms of the value it would provide. Okay, if I'm going to say, hey, having a 5G network would boost the accuracy of my wayfinding solution, where I'm able to go down to a bay level or a stall level rather than within a 5 meter or a 6 meter radius. Those are the things that drive us to be able to engage. If I'm talking about my building services, how do I get into predictive modeling in terms of how digital twin of the building and of the assets would start to fit in, right? The moment you talk about digital twin, it then ingests huge volume of data. And when I say data, we're not talking about spatial data, correlating space with devices, with sensors, and with people, and using that to drive intelligence and engagement of productivity within that space is what we're after. And that leads us to make innovative choices.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Rahul, last but not least on the first round, you are with a company called View, which I've been very interested in for a number of years. Ken, again, was one of the first people. We did a panel together, and we had one of your people there. I'm fascinated by what you're doing. You've got a couple of slides and a little bit of background on what you're doing. Can you introduce us to View and what you're doing and how it fits in with this communications piece? It's not necessarily, and I'm not usually interested in commercials here, but I think what you're doing is so vital from a communication standpoint that it was worth, letting you roll through this. So without further ado, tell us about View.
Great. Thanks, Rich, and thanks for having me on the panel. Hanan, if you could switch the slides, that'd be great. Rich, I'll make this not an infomercial. I want to provide a little bit of context so all the listeners have context of where we're going with this. If you just go to the next slide. Hanan, just to the next slide.
Yep.
So, yeah. So I do want to start with this. Sorry, go back one, please. I think you jumped one. I did want to set the stage before I talked about View, about a little bit to specify, what we thought of as even 5 years ago was the future of real estate, what are the big trends. And we focused really on three. One was around really buildings are about people, so the health and wellness of people in buildings and the comfort and how basically all of us are interested in how we get people to have a better experience in buildings. The world was also focused on energy efficiency, sustainability. That was probably the most well-known one. And then the third one really being around intelligent buildings. And I'd say, groups like Tavistock and maybe companies like Microsoft who were more foresighted were focused on all three. The rest of the world kind of was focused in the middle, but listened to the other two with some level of interest. I think the current situation is accelerating that trend quite a bit. And my belief, at least, is that
We lost the audio on Rahul. Are you back? Rahul? We lost your audio there.
It looks like Rahul's mic is off.
Yeah. Rahul, why don't you...
Until his volume comes back on, let me jump in for a second. So we look at, and great point by Eric and Emmanuel, we look at in terms of, if this was 45 days ago, we would look at mobility and connectivity as one of the most important things to offer our occupiers, right? And so we don't necessarily come up with these technologies, sitting in a room. What we do is we pull people in. And so we would steal from the, other industries, such as the medical, what Eric talked about, and pull these things in that they were doing. And Rahul, tell me when you're back online. I'll shut up. Okay,
Yeah,
great. I'll
I'm
let you
back.
go. I'll talk later about our experience with View and why we felt it was so important to put it in all of our buildings going forward.
So sorry about that, Rich. I think if you go to the next slide, please, Anand. I think I'll take a second to just explain who we are and what we do. We're a 12-year-old company at this point. We make smart. And if you think of smart glass, it's really, I think all of you are familiar with transition lenses. These are, you wear glasses when you go outside, they tint with they automatically adjust with sunlight. We effectively do the same thing, but we do it for buildings. Hanan, please go to the next slide and just hit play. There's a short time-lapse video there. And, a picture's worth 1,000 words here. What you'll see is this is actually one of our installations in New York. What we enable for buildings is to essentially have the building be a giant, you think of sunglasses for buildings. When we're installed, there are no blinds in that building. We're effectively providing natural light. We're providing a lot of views. That's why we named the company View. In the process of doing this, we also save energy. We will reduce the energy footprint of a building by about 15 to 20%. And importantly, Rich, for this panel, it's a digital skin around the building. So every window has data and power to it. It's IP addressable. And as you'll see in a minute, a lot of the applications that Emmanuel mentioned, whether it's wayfinding or personalization of the environment to people, and importantly, even just providing the entire connectivity infrastructure to make it localized around the building itself. We enable all of those. Before I jump into the sustainability, just go to the next slide. I want to share some research that's come out over the last few years. Eric will know this because this was well known in the medical world that natural light is good for people. There was a lot of research in healthcare around patients doing better with light. What we've seen now in offices and homes and different environments, and this is some research out of Cornell and University of Illinois, is some pretty dramatic results for people in buildings when they get more natural light. So you see 50% plus drops in eye strain and headaches and reported depression. People are actually sleeping longer by about 35 to 40 minutes. They actually have higher cognitive scores and tests. Absolutely amazing results. And they've now been validated in several different studies. We've seen similar results in healthcare environments where patients, report higher satisfaction. They also actually recover faster post-surgery. And I guess somewhat topical now, what we're seeing more as we talk to companies about their re-entry strategies is the fact that not having blinds in buildings is an advantage of having fewer surface areas to actually gather germs and viruses and other infections. That's again something hospitals have done for a while. I think the rest of real estate will catch on to doing that over the next few years. You move on, I'll maybe go to the next slide, please, and I'll talk about the smart aspect of it. I mentioned earlier, every window we essentially make has an IP address and data and power coming to it. So our vision around this, as we work with, some of Emmanuel's peers and, Microsoft, other companies with Lake Nona, is to really use the skin of the building to enable some pretty compelling applications. One, as we install, our windows are installed, we provide a full converged network around the building that obviously is used to drive our windows, but also a few other applications that we'll enable. So everything from a personalized space where, as Rich, let's say you walk into an office, it knows it's Rich, it adjusts the light levels, the temperature. We're measuring things like air quality and CO2 levels and so on. We'll essentially optimize the environment to you. The doing things like physical security. If somebody were to break into your building because the glass is powered, it would know in a second. We're able to do asset tracking. Interestingly, for this panel, I think as one of the things that has saved us, I would say, working remotely is the connectivity piece, right? And while communities like Lake Nona have gigabit fiber everywhere, the rest of the world is not there yet. What we aim to do with our infrastructure is also provide similar connectivity across a building, so across vertical planes and the entire floor space, but then also embed antennas into the window frames themselves. So one of the issues with 5G, I think a lot of your listeners will realize, is it doesn't penetrate materials, right? Whether it's drywall or glass. And we are already working with a few of our customers to take signals from outside and propagate them inside the building. And so you have perfect coverage, you have low latency, your data resides locally in the building itself. It's better from a security perspective. And then eventually we'll move on to kind of new applications. We also, as we provide the platform, our view is we'll provide some of these applications ourselves where we are uniquely qualified to serve them. And the rest we'll provide, just open APIs and let building owners innovate on those. And I think the biggest benefit we see, even in the longer term for a building owner, is peace of mind around future-proofing the assets, around optionality. So as none of us know what the world is going to look like in 5 years. What we want to do is build in the right infrastructure today when you make a building so that it's there for the next 20 to 30 years. And I just a couple of applications. Please go to the next slide.
And Rahul, before you leave that slide, I just wanted to add in, from our perspective at Lake Nona, we look at, it's very expensive for a tenant to go back and get these benefits later, right? So we looked at it as, you can duplicate a building really anywhere, right? So we felt the responsibility as the developer was to build a shell that could provide, like I said before, efficiencies and productivity and recruiting benefits at the shell stage. And so if you go back and look at, in terms of all of our buildings going forward, we'll have view glass. But when you look at in terms of, the value to us was mobility, allowing people to move throughout the building, take advantage of our 5G network outside. You mentioned something which I think is would have been a big conversation back 45 days ago, but you mentioned CO2 levels, right? And you're able to track those CO2 levels, but you're also able to track virus. But those CO2 levels are important because after an hour of sitting in a conference room, you're losing 30% of productivity of people, going forward and sitting in a room together. So all I want to do is go back and say, as a developer, and also, we're a business owner. We have over 200 companies in our portfolio. We're always looking at how do we create space that creates this productivity, right? And so we felt it was important to all of these technologies to do these things earlier in the process and provide the occupiers with a shell so that they could take advantage of these benefits and check the box as they need them.
Yeah. So I've got a question before we get off that, Rahul. So I saw a demonstration by a cybersecurity expert a number of years ago. And he was talking about silly things like, in the Jacob Javits Center, if you saw a plug on the wall, he could go in with his laptop and he was into the network of the building. But it seems to me that a security aspect of this, if you've got an API for every window, if you've got an IP address for every window, I should say, if you've got an IP address for every window, that gives you the ability to have every potential window in that as a hackable location, an addressable location. How are you handling that from a cybersecurity aspect?
So that's a great question. So, Rich, there's a couple of things. One is, you are very conscious of the fact that both data privacy and security are increasing issues as we look forward, right? And increasing sensitivity to those. So we're doing a couple of things. One is, as we just design the stack itself, we're even working with some of our partner companies to design an encryption at the hardware level. So we actually have a controller in every window. And I think Emmanuel can speak more to this, but Microsoft's one of the companies working also on embedding some security into silicon itself. So once you have a handshake there, you can actually hack it. So we're designing that in, and we're not inventing all of this ourselves. We're taking best of breed on what exists in the world.
So Rahul, I'm sorry. Finish. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, and the second point was around, if I leave the hacking on the side, now security is the data privacy issues. What we're doing there is, if you're in a environment, different use cases. So if you're in an airport, for example, our solution will have cameras and mics, and you can actually interact with them. In office environments, we're anonymizing all the information. So essentially, it's not personally identifiable. We're very conscious of the fact that our biggest kind of application is for office buildings where you have sophisticated enterprises around, they have sophisticated views on how to handle data. So we're anonymizing all of it. So a practical example is, if you and I are sitting in a room, it knows there's two of us there. It doesn't know personally identifiably it's Rich and Rahul. It just knows there's two people here.
So I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just to pause this. We've got a couple of questions that have come in for Eric. So what I'd like to do is go back to you as we go around and talk with Emmanuel about the cybersecurity aspects. But I'd like to get these two questions in for Eric, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Eric, the question came in, this is a great one. How are hospital wireless networks holding up at with all this added operational demand? Broadly, it is believed that hospitals do not have adequate ubiquitous wireless networks that provide enough coverage capacity. Is that accurate? Great question.
Yeah, a very good question, actually. So to answer the question, and thank you, Eric, for asking that. So for on-prem, hospitals are traditionally relying on their Wi-Fi networking. The reason being traditionally because they can control that in terms of permissioned endpoint devices and so forth. Also for what they perceive as optimal HIPAA requirements. Where they've run into capacity issues, they've actually deployed additional Wi-Fi capabilities and so forth. Bear in mind that the healthcare industry has traditionally been slow to adopt cellular modalities, mainly because of the perceived costs associated with that. That has changed. In fact, I'd argue that in most situations, cellular is actually probably more cost effective than maintaining a Wi-Fi network. But nonetheless, so far there hasn't been any sort of capacity coverage issues per se. Now, where things flip is when we're off-prem. So if we get into a situation, I'll use McCormick Place in downtown Chicago as an example, or a converted physician office building for providing patient care. In situations like that, where the healthcare enterprise does not own or manage the existing infrastructure, there they default, as they should, to using cellular capabilities supplemented with augmentation through small cell technology or something to that effect. One of the things that the industry is very excited about is the 5G technology, and how can we integrate that, or how can hospital systems integrate that into the suite of technologies. But for COVID, for instance, right now, there hasn't been any sort of issues that have really percolated in the landscape. So hopefully that answers the question. And then there's a second question from Tony. I'll read that. With regard to telemedicine, all types of patient info potentially being transported over wireless networks across a facility or between facilities, what are the underlying concerns to be aware of when it comes to maintaining the security integrity of all this highly personal data? So in response to that, HIPAA regulations were relaxed somewhat to allow for greater scale and adoption of new technology. So a great example of this is Zoom for inpatient care settings. Zoom is not HIPAA compliant pre-COVID. So what healthcare systems are doing right now is being intelligent about it. So what that means is, wherever possible, using HIPAA compliant technologies that are secure and locked down. So the endpoint devices such as tablets could use a mobile device management capabilities. AirWatch is a great example of that. Or Samsung's Knox platform, or Microsoft has similar capabilities. Teams, by the way, we have Microsoft here, is a great example of a platform that's being utilized in the healthcare space that is able to ensure the security of those conversations and so forth. So another example to answer the question is using end-to-end encryption, so 256-bit AES encryption standards, and so forth. At the end of the day, it's not so much the technology, but how the technology is being used and what of the workflow, the clinical workflows, how those are being handled. So for instance, do I firewall my electronic health record, for instance, from patient-generated data because of the concerns over privacy and so forth? Do I partition my video and voice sessions from the rest of the tele-ICU data and so forth? So at the end of the day, just in summary, it really depends on the specific application of the technologies, but the industry has been able to use the mobile connectivity service developments over the last 10, 15 years to really address this quite well. Now, having said all this, and Rich, you touched on this earlier, the number one industry, this may come as a surprise to people, for data attacks and so forth, you would think it'd be the financial industry. It's not. It's actually the healthcare industry.
Gotcha.
And the reason, yeah.
I'm sorry, Eric, I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to make sure we get Emmanuel in here because I'd really like to hear his thoughts on this. So,
Sure.
Emmanuel, you're the security and privacy arbiter that the company is very much in this. And so, how do you view this from, you've got a guy here who's saying, I'm going to put, an IP address in every pane of glass, and I'm going to project things onto that glass. How do you view that from the standpoint of safety and security and if I'm going to project Microsoft Teams onto that glass, how does that all work into the safety and security piece of this, including the HIPAA piece, if you can opine on that?
So Rich, I'm going to extend that problem to even a larger area, right? You're talking about glass, which is the skin of the building. Okay, in addition to the glass, I'm going to have lights. Now, today, every light is IP enabled as well. You've got digital lights or digital ceilings. Now, added to those lights, you also have data collection devices. What Rahul has on the slide, he talks about sensors that are embedded into the panels, but you also have sensors that are not. You have sensors in places that may not go through a lighting network or through the glass that we've seen. Now, if I take a campus for size, and we are looking at the new Redmond campus modernization that's going through, we're basically talking about close to 100,000 devices that would go into these buildings. So I have lights, I have devices, I have glass, and I have network security coming in. So for us, security starts fundamentally at the device level. How do I secure that device? Is that device going to have an MCU that is Azure Sphere certified? So it has real-time protection in terms of, and it is up to date with respect to all the security aspect that the chip needs to have. So we make it less likely to get compromised. Two, we then start talking about fraudulent data. So there may be a case where we have a device, but everything is fine. But for some strange reason, we have fraudulent data coming in, because of which, we can overrun and shut down the buildings, or burn out the devices that we have within the buildings, or just give fraudulent reason to say that, hey, the building is actually empty, but we're looking at a load of 1,000 people in the building because you've got, the HVAC is going into overdrive. So catching that data in terms of understanding that, is this actually fraud data? Is this data actually meaningful based on external parameters that exist? So device security, quality of the data, authenticating the nature of the data, the type of the data that comes in. Third, on top of that, we then start looking at, and I think Rahul spoke about anonymization of data, and so did Eric and Ken, is anonymization taking care of repeatable patterns of individuals. So I cannot use that pattern to predict and say, hey, with 80% accuracy, that's person X in the room. That's a big big red flag for us. So how do you anonymize and break patterns in behavior that people tend to do where you can use to predict? Now, combining all this together, we then also have to look at the privacy aspects. So healthcare data is a big deal for us because all of a sudden we spoke about temperature scanners early on at the very first part of it. If I'm going to take temperature readings of people that walk in through my building, that's health related data, that's personal data related to that person, right? So then the HIPAA regulations start to kick in. How do I ensure I can do this without creating paranoia within a space to ensure that, hey, okay, I'm going to take the only type of data that you allow me to collect, which is going to be for the benefits, okay, of everyone. So starting at the device, okay, ensuring the device is secure, having something like an Azure Sphere on it, to starting at the network. We start talking about network segmentation, different family of devices across different segments of network, so that if any one of them are compromised, I don't lose out the whole network, right? So we start talking about facilities network, where I have all my core facilities going on it. The fourth point that I really want to add is we keep talking about 5G, and that's a great point, and I think I completely agree with Eric in terms of how that has absolutely complemented the way people connect and interact. But that then depends on your distributed antenna systems that you have to deploy across your infrastructure, be it in a garage, be it in a building. The cost tied to that, the implementation tied to that, and securing the endpoints in terms of either they are coax endpoints or fiber endpoints, how is that going to be done? So physical security of the cable themselves and the conduits through which they run is another layer of security that we add. So you see, Rich, it's not just securing the device. The physical layout, the placement of the device, the conduits the device goes in, the data that the device generates. So it's a complete layered security mechanism that we follow.
Yeah, so I get it, and that's very, very informative. But my friend Ken here has a development of people that are sharing their medical data with them on purpose. So Ken, how does this, from a HIPAA standpoint, from a security standpoint, from a medical standpoint, how does all that fit together from your world? Because you are leading the way in terms of, you gave us a number, you want to repeat what the percentage of people in Lake Nona that actually voluntarily give you their health data. Can you talk us through that piece of it?
Sure. So it's around 72%, excuse me. It's around 72% of the residents at Lake Nona share their some level of their health records with us. So it could be exercise habits, wearables, medical records, eating habits, and it's a program that's administered through Harvard. And we've been as high as 80%, but the community is growing so quickly that we have to get these people signed up, and they actually re-sign up every year. So it's HIPAA compliant. It's a program where, look, we're a strong believer that data technology, if you use the data, it can result in better outcomes. And so we gather a lot of data. We're very open about the data. Our residents are, they call themselves citizen scientists, and we use those data for those better outcomes. And so, we've had really sort of an interesting result in the data. We didn't really know where it was going to go, except for we could provide feedback back to the residents that could result in benefits to them. But when you start looking go back to those 4 things I highlighted originally, that comes from the corporate real estate world in terms of building culture, is can it result in better productivity? Can result in efficiencies? Can result in recruiting? And what we've seen is that if you run a sleep study, right, if you have 68% of America in the workforce doesn't get a proper night's sleep, and the result of that is we're losing an hour and a half of productivity before 1 o'clock the next day, then that's a big deal, right? If we're all trying to increase productivity and maintain a workforce. So we said, like, since we're literally building a city, it's very important for us to focus on the community, because those people are also working for the companies that are in our community, right? And if we can coach those residents, right, and we see that, hey, X% of the residents are, falling in that same 68%, what can we do, right? And if we have that wearable data, we can then start to look at trends in terms of, is it just you're drinking caffeine at night? What are your habits? So it's really interesting, how you can use that data and convert it back to the workforce. I don't think people necessarily move to Lake Nona because they're in great shape and they're extremely healthy. I think what happens is they move to Lake Nona and they're educated about how to become healthier, and they become healthier. And then the result is you've got a healthier workforce.
Gotcha. So Eric had a comment that I wanted him to jump in at. Eric, did you want to add to what you were?
I did. One of the things we've touched on, something I think that's important, is we've created a scaffold of basically digital services that are wirelessly connected. And I think that's very important, because if we look at it in terms of a scalable but sustainable model, we can now start integrating different capabilities. So to the earlier points, the industry is actually shifting away from wearables. They were very, very popular and still do remain popular, but what's really exciting to see now on the topic of HIPAA and so forth is sort of the automated contactless capabilities. So for instance, being able to use what's called room radar to capture vitals information, such as your heart rate and so forth, so you don't actually have to be encumbered. So you think of people in an active living community, aging in place and so forth. You think of things like smart bathrooms, for instance, and this isn't science fiction, these are shipping products where you look in the mirror and it can let you know your blood sugar level. For instance, if you're predisposed to type 2 diabetes, your cholesterol level, and so forth, your blood pressure. And these are all products that can now be incorporated into these next gen buildings and so forth. I think what's really exciting is, back to we talked about the thermal sensors and so forth, and this sort of digital scaffold around the building. What that becomes then is a way to have that sort of that robust and resilient connectivity for all these data points. Measuring different vitals, and it's permissioned. So 2-3 years ago, everyone was abuzz with blockchain and so forth. If we park the term blockchain and we think more about people permissioning sharing of their personal information, which then complies with HIPAA requirements and so forth, then what you end up having actually is not just smart, but actionable intelligence around the people and the activities happening in the building, so you can be very proscriptive in terms of managing people that may, for instance, have a comorbidity and so forth. And it's these types of things, we were talking earlier about the light levels and so forth. We're able to then see, is if there's not sufficient lighting, and if someone, for instance, is having a physiological response to that, we can take those necessary actions. So what the industry's recognized is that just simply layering devices onto people and so forth, sort of more of a 1990s type of models move towards this new total mobility model, where we're able to leverage developments that I just mentioned.
Gotcha. So
And Eric,
Rahul, am I going to have to give my view glass a urine specimen every day? Is that what we're getting to here?
We're not quite there. We're not quite there, but I'd say wholeheartedly agree with what Eric just said. We see kind of a similar thing where our pardon the pun view is we see the trend towards contactless information, kind of both information gathering and then getting intelligent decisions out of it. And our broader point is to make it as seamless as possible. So we do see that trend moving away from wearables, more towards just devices being smartly integrated, but then also using, first programmatic approaches and now machine learning and so on to get real insights out of it. We're doing some of the same things that Eric mentioned in hospitals and even in office spaces. I think the other point, which both Ken and Eric said, is we're actually positively surprised that once you educate people and inform them of what the value of that information is, a lot of them are absolutely happy to give you permission and opt in. I think this is exactly why Lake Nona sees such high adoption rates of 72, 75%, because those citizens are actually seeing the value of providing that information. There's a very tangible benefit. We see the same thing, and that's our vision in this. People just opt in, and it'll just make their life much more convenient and measurably better on a daily basis.
Gotcha. So I want to just let everybody know, Rahul, I'm going to let you finish your slides now, but we're going to go past the 1 hour mark because I think there's more to talk about on this panel. So Rahul, I'd like you to finish your slides and talk, about the rest of what's going on with View. Please go ahead.
Sure. So this was just, and we stopped on this one. I think this is where actually it's an excellent one where our intent is, we look at the environment and say, let's essentially all of the things that we normally care about, and whether, it's the obvious environmental variables like temperature and humidity and light levels and comfort, but then going further, and Ken said this earlier, right? Air quality and CO2 levels. Even before COVID, everybody knew this. You sit in a room for a long time, you get stuffy. You actually start losing cognitive function when CO2 levels go up. There's a very well-known Harvard study that proves that out very well. Dust levels. And the point is to take all of this and not have, Rich, you and me as people living in a building actually worry about it, right? The solutions basically just collect that information, automatically make sense of it.
Unfortunately, Rahul, we've lost you again. So let's go to Ken. Ken,
Rich, if I could jump in and go back to something that both Emmanuel and Eric were talking about in terms of, we educating of the occupier, whether it's a resident or a commercial occupier, was really a focus for us. And we have a smart home in the city of Lake Nona, and it gives the chance for the residents to come in and see these things, right? And see the monitoring and see the censoring and we agree that the wearables have sort of been replaced by other technology, but we've also gotten to a point where telemedicine. We've got examples of telemedicine for kids and adults, and we really saw that as far as, and Eric says it's best. It's about patient safety and provider safety, right? That's what it's about, right? You don't want to bring someone into an environment where they could get sick. We've also moved to the next level where we're actually working with a program where we've got smart toilets or a smart toilet, and the program would go to the next level where you roll out smart toilets, where now we're taking urine samples that could start to predict illnesses with an 80% plus rate if you're taking multiple samples a day. Over a 60-90 day period, all of a sudden you can start to predict the data analytics a year, 5 years out, right? It goes back to, it's all about sort of creating a healthier workforce and a healthier residential base too.
Yeah. So Ken, is there any other whiz bang stuff you're working on? Because you've always been my go-to guy on that.
Every time I call in, we've got something new. But
yeah.
I think the big thing goes back to the reason we have this call, right? It's about connectivity. It's about we put in fiber back 10 plus years ago, and that enabled us to really leapfrog and put all these devices in and not have problems when we use something like Zoom, for example. But also now we're at the point where we work with all of the providers in terms of the telecom, but we've got a very extensive project with Verifone right now, where we're laying out a very extensive 5G network, and that 5G network will cover all 17 square miles of Lake Nona, and all different property types, right, from restaurants to office and industrial, and we've got a 2 million square foot Amazon distribution center. We're also adjacent to the Orlando airport, which up until recently, had 72 million people coming through. It's a great place for us to try things out. And so, when you talk about what are we doing, Eric talked about telemedicine and med tech. We've got incubators, 30,000 foot incubator. That's a medical and healthcare incubator by Guidewell. We've got a new one opening up that focuses more on tech, sports, and healthcare. But you start looking at what is 5G going to do for us? One of the areas that we look at in terms of the transfer of data at a quicker speed. There's an accident on the motorway, and we're all roads lead through Lake Nona to get to the airport. you could perhaps go out and there's an accident on the motorway. Instead of going out, stabilizing and moving a patient back to the airport or back to the hospital, now you can go out, stabilize, start to diagnose, start treatment, which before was quicker to just transport them back to the hospital. So, you look at, I go back to, the connectivity really is the heart of what we do, right? For Rahul, it's in terms of, using the 5G, the 4G, and the Wi-Fi, whether it's Wi-Fi 6, whatever it is, it's using that data to create those better outcomes. But the platform is there.
Good. So let's see if Rahul's back with us.
Yep, I'm back. And Rich, I think Ken, I should mention, I think what you're doing with the Whit House, and I saw telemedicine there working both with Verizon and through our windows there about a month ago was fantastic. Lake Nona is also using essentially fully autonomous buses now to move people around the community. And these are actually live. So it's very impressive. I'd encourage anyone who's there to actually visit.
So Emmanuel, I'd like to kind of start to wrap this up, but I wanted to ask you a question. Is sort of, when we start talking about 5G, there's got to be something in the Microsoft playbook that's going to say, gee, we see, when we saw 4G coming, we didn't understand that it would spawn Uber and Lyft and it would Grubhub and all those things. We didn't see that coming necessarily from the rollout of the 4G network. So we see 5G rolling out now. I cannot establish very many use cases that companies can say, here's a 5G network, here's what we're doing with it, and it's really interesting and it's very different. Is there anything in the Microsoft playbook that you can share with us that's a 5G killer app that you know of or that's coming that you might want to share with us?
So I'll tell you what we're looking at it for. Killer app, we haven't published it yet, so I can't basically talk about it. But in terms of what we're trying to do is with the coming in of 5G, when you look at the campus that we operate at, roughly 500 acres, and the new development that we're doing for the Redmond campus modernization is around 72 acres. The goal for us is to hand experience and capability into the hands of anyone that comes onto the campus. So the ability to be able to work anywhere, green space, built environment, open space, wherever you want to have, and having that same level of connectivity, collaboration, and access that you would get on an on-prem network or an in-building network, driving that engagement and being able to collaborate, share that data, capture that data effectively, is one of the key things that we're looking at 5G will drive. So the last mile connectivity, rather than having a Wi-Fi mesh scattered across a 500-acre campus, which may not be feasible, to Eric and Ken's point, where they say hospitals are large and they have cell networks in there, that is going to drive an unprecedented level of collaboration amongst people. And what we are looking to do is anybody who comes onto our campus, be it a visitor, be it a guest, or be it an interviewee, accessing our services through those networks so that we're able to provide that safe, secure connectivity, enabling to leverage the campus that we have is what we're going to see that 5G is going to drive for us.
Gotcha. So Rahul, I'm going to let you finish up your presentation and then wrap this up with that, if you wouldn't mind, because obviously you had a presentation. We lost you a couple of times. So if you want to finish up and let's wrap it up with that, but go for it.
Sure. Just a couple more. So if you go to the, please hit next slide. So we were talking about 5G. This is just an implementation of how we're actually putting in units, radio units, both on the inside of the building as well as on the outside. So effectively, we want to turn the building becomes the infrastructure, and have much better coverage, both from getting signals inwards and ensuring perfect coverage, but in very dense urban environments. If you think of Times Square or Manhattan, even being able to use the building as an antenna itself. So these are actually in trials today. So they're not some extremely futuristic solution. They're in trials. They'll be commercially available in the near future. And to your point, Rich, I think what, you asked what the killer app was. And I think, we'll all have our views, but reality is no one knows what they are today. The critical thing is really, if you're someone making the assets or building buildings, is what, people like Ken are doing, which is build the infrastructure in today already so that the nervous system exists. And whatever the new killer app happens to be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, you're ready to actually serve it.
Gotcha.
And then next slide, I have one last. This will be an interesting application. I think some people your audience will enjoy seeing. This is one, if you look at, it's a visual, it's much easier to see in a video. And this is live at Lake Nona today. Behind the lady, you see some, high definition display. That is literally a transparent display where if you turn off, it's a regular window. So you can look through the window and then you can turn it on. And if you're in an office, you use it for, for displaying information. In hospitals, you use it for telemedicine and remote diagnosis by doctors. Airports are planning to use this. Some of the airports you're working with to really provide contextual information at gates, but then also to do biometric check-ins of passengers boarding flights. And I think there'll be several collaboration here gets, we actually do Teams calls and Zoom calls in our offices already using the windows as the displays.
Gotcha. So one of the things we talked about the other day, and I'm going to leave it at this and say thank you to all of you, but we talked about the potential for you to put sniffing devices to see if there's virus in the air in this situation down the road.
Yep.
So I was very interested in that. We've gone over. I thank you all for being part of this. Please, those of you that are watching us and listening to us, go in and visit our exhibitors and our sponsors because they are the ones that are helping us put this on. For our panelists, I thank you so much for being a part of this. Ken, this was all for, your idea, and I thank you for it. Rahul, and Emmanuel, and Eric, thank you for being on with us today. And thank you all for listening and watching. And we have the next keynote is at 1 o'clock with Darlene Pope, which I will be chatting with her about at that point in time. It looks like we've popped up a couple of questions before I let everybody go. Rahul, this is for you. Is this tech using rebroadcast of outdoor signal for the antennas that you're using, or is this an internal radio connected antenna?
Mm-hmm.
It's actually rebroadcast. Oh, okay. So for the antennas, I think there's maybe a couple of questions there if I interpret this question. So one is, was this around the displays or is this around the antennas?
On the antennas.
Oh, so antennas would be different. We'll have a couple of different implementations. One would be using the backhaul coming into the building using fiber. We will also have different solutions that will use signal from outside. So both two separate products or two separate implementations.
Gotcha. Well, thank you again for being with us today. And Hanan, we can end the call now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Rich, for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
For having us.
Right.